Hello and welcome to this session at the Bradford Literature Festival digital programme for 2021. My name is Akhil Ahmed. I am a broadcaster and academic, and today I'm going to be having a conversation with Saeed Khan, who's a senior lecturer of Near Eastern and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit, as well as research fellow at its Centre for the Study of Citizenship. Saeed. So then, today we're going to be having a conversation about the 20th anniversary of 9/11. We're going to be looking at some of the kind of issues around what happened at that time, but also really looking at what it has meant for many, many communities and individuals in the 20 years since that momentous occasion. Now, I know where I was at that moment. When that moment happened, I was a young executive producer in the BBC. I was sat in my office, somebody ran in and said to me, Akhil, turn the TV on. And I turned the TV on, and there was a plane had crashed into the Twin Towers. Suddenly, my little office was full of lots of people, all crowding around my desk, looking at the TV. We're all saying, oh my God, how unlucky is that? How unlucky is that? And then the second plane went in. And at that point, I realized, oh, I think I know what's happened. And then I had to go and get my bosses out and said, I'm really sorry, I've got to break this meeting, but you need to come out here. And for me, and for many people, life was never the same again. Where were you when it happened?
Well, I was in my family room watching TV and having my morning cup of tea and watching the Today Show, as a matter of fact. And I remember that they cut back from commercial to show the first tower smoldering. And I, like you, had a similar reaction, thinking how unfortunate, wondering if it was a traffic helicopter or maybe a small plane that had crashed into it, because it certainly looked different from what could have been just simply a building fire. And like you, a few minutes later, live, seeing the second plane hitting the tower and having that sinking feeling that this is not normal. And given the fact that in the mid-1990s, there was already a buildup of suspicion toward Muslims, especially after the 1993 World Trade Center attack. There was this strange feeling of saying, please, God, let it not be, but still exploring and entertaining the possibility that it was committed by Muslims. And I just remember from that point on, and for the next roughly maybe 13 hours, my phone did not stop ringing. And it's the only time I remember that the battery on my cordless phone, this is before mobiles became really a big thing, but my cordless landline phone died just simply from overuse. And it was friends calling, asking what's going on, is this what we think it is? And I just remember trying to make every possible excuse, thinking it's got to be something else. Around this time, there were a lot of demonstrations and protests of the World Trade Organization and the G7 and various meetings, and thinking, okay, maybe it's some kinds of eco activists or anybody else. And then, of course, the plane hit the Pentagon. And then there was another one that came down thanks to the passengers in rural Pennsylvania. And then, of course, the very graphic scenes of the World Trade Center coming down. And for us in Detroit, there are, of course, two different dimensions to this. On the one hand, a large Arab and Muslim community, and thinking ahead, what was this going to mean? And the other is that my campus, Wayne State, has an interesting connection to the World Trade Center. The architect of those buildings, Minoru Yamazaki, has designed at least 4 buildings that we have on campus. And so within literally the blink of an eye, the legacy of this amazing architect is now preserved on our university campus when his iconic building no longer exists. So there was a multitude of thoughts and emotions that were going through my mind in this very short period of time.
And do you remember, because it's actually one of the things that's forgotten about now, is, do you remember what happened in that 48 hours before? Do you remember the line of the Afghan warlord, or what for many of us, he was a mujahideen, a freedom fighter from the Russians.
Well, Mullah Omar.
Well, not Ahmed Shah Massoud.
Ahmed Shah Massoud.
He was taken out I think
That's right.
24 hours or so before, which many say was a prelude to the event. So there was a real moment. There was something really happening at that time that now, 20 years on, we can look back on and probably say that this was the beginning of the end of the world that we lived in. Or do you think that's too dramatic a thing to say?
I think looking back on it now with the beauty of 2020 hindsight, we can go ahead and extrapolate that. I mean, here you had, as you said, Ahmad Shah Massoud being taken out, Mullah Omar, the father-in-law of Osama bin Laden, refusing to give him up because of Afghan custom and tradition. I think it's easy to say that that is something that should have put our antenna up. But given the planning and the premeditation that must have been involved in coordinating something of the magnitude of the 9/11 attacks, it's easy to say now that, okay, it was more obvious that it was. I would probably put it now to the idea that our intelligence services here in the US were so clearly asleep. The National Security Advisor in those days was Condoleezza Rice. And the fact that despite all the chatter that comes through the NSA, that she didn't pick up on this, especially given the kind of hypervigilance that it seems that the US had regarding the potential of so-called Muslim extremism and acts, that seems to be the real dereliction of duty. But the idea, and I'm sure you caught this when you were watching the images of New York City, it was a perfectly blue sky morning. I mean, if there was anything that was eerily calm about that imagery that was shattered at 8:46 a.m., was the fact about how banal the day was. It was a September autumn day or late summer day in New York. It was exactly the same weather as was here in Detroit. There did not seem to be anything to indicate what was then going to change the world, as you said.
And it certainly did. On a personal level, how did it change your world?
At that point, I was actually practicing law, and I found myself thrust into this rather improbable role of, first of all, wanting to do something, and then getting the call to do it when I realized that the Muslim community in the Metro Detroit area was literally shell-shocked. And they were having trouble processing what it meant, what it was going to mean looking forward to them and their futures and that of their families. And we were having calls come in from friends saying, should we leave the country? What else is there that can happen? How much worse can it get? And this was, of course, in that 48-hour period right after the attacks. And having to tell people, I don't know, and give them that kind of uncertainty, I think was perhaps even more unnerving. The idea that there really weren't any answers. We were truly in uncharted territory. Along with that, the fact that Muslims now, as they ventured out, those who had the courage or who had the necessity to venture out, were being confronted, not necessarily in a hostile way, but in a highly inquisitive way by others who were traumatized and who were trying to seek answers themselves, standing in line at the grocery store, at work, at school. And people would lead with the question, it's like, excuse me, but are you a Muslim? And for those who are wearing headscarves, which of course is quite visible here in the Metro Detroit area, asking them questions, and having Muslims then having to be on the spot experts in theology, philosophy, economics, political science, history, culture. It was, of course, very, very overwhelming. So I found myself putting together workshops about how to talk about Islam and how to talk about Muslim culture and community, because these were really the questions that were being asked, trying to figure out a demographic that, although it had been certainly in plain sight for decades in the US, now all of a sudden were being discovered. because of what happened on 9/11 in a way that didn't even happen after the Iranian Revolution and the taking of American hostages in 1979. And
Well,
so
because it was on foreign soil, wasn't it? And
it was on foreign
yeah.
soil. And of course, this was literally seen in real time. This America has so many moments where there is, as you said, a collective and shared experience of where were you when. The Kennedy assassination, of course, being one. The John Lennon assassination being another. Reagan being shot in 1981. Similarly, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986. This was the first one in quite a few years. And of course, the magnitude and the coverage was so profound. But to try to allay the anxieties that the Muslim American community intuitively realized that it was now going to get much worse. 1993 with the World Trade Center attack was, of course, a problem. But I remember in 1995 when in Oklahoma City, a federal government building was brought down by white supremacists. The immediate presumption was that it was Muslims. And then, of course, the following year when TWA Flight 800 exploded shortly after takeoff from New York City, again, the specter of suspicion was, well, it had to be Muslims. So there was a sort of an acclamation and a realization among Muslim Americans that we were being suspected, even without any true evidence of it happening. And it reminds me of the American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, who had written that how does it feel to be a problem in addressing the Black American community? And here that problematization was now being visited on the Muslim American community, that we were being seen and presumed to be the T word before there was any evidence to demonstrate it. Of course,
it was a very different experience, wasn't it, before 9/11? Because I used to go to America quite a lot on business in those days as a filmmaker. And everybody would be asking you questions about, where you're from, what your family do. And I was very lucky to not just go to New York or Washington, but to go to places like Wyoming or Tallahassee and all these kind of, normal American places. And they would just be fascinated. And, you'd hop on and off a plane like you were just getting on a bus. Yeah. It was an amazing. The biggest problem we had was getting flight cases on and off some of these really small planes that would take you from one city or one town to another. I mean, did life really radically alter for you as a Muslim in America after 9/11?
Well, I think to be fair, life radically altered for everyone in America. And I think that that's something that's a very important factor to consider. That 9/11 changed everybody's lives, it changed everybody's perceptions, and I think it changed everybody's intersocial relations with one another. There was suspicion, and certainly the Muslim American community faced that. In large part, as you said, prior to that, and I've been to Wyoming a few times myself, a beautiful country out there, and not a very large Muslim population to be sure, but accepting, tolerant at the time, in that great American ethos that everything goes, just don't get up to my nose, and we'll be fine. And I think the Muslim American community was lulled into a sense of complacency, in part because of the illusion of the American dream. You come to the US, you follow the Protestant work ethic, sometimes more diligently than even Protestants, and you will achieve then the dream that is promoted and projected around the world through pop culture and otherwise. And the idea that staying clean and out of trouble was the formula to not only achieving that dream, but also being accepted, whether in urban life, suburban life, or in rural life. I mean, my own parents, for example, live in a very small town, about an hour and a half outside Detroit. And ironically enough, where two of the three Oklahoma City bombing perpetrators hail from. What was shattered was the idea on 9/11 that the Muslim American experience of achieving the American dream also provided for Muslim Americans insulation and immunization from criticism, from greater suspicion, and perhaps recrimination. That was all gone after that.
Yeah, well, I think in the UK, when I look back, when I think about, I have this. I was trying to think about it over the last couple of days, and I remember driving home from work that evening. I was working in Manchester. I was driving home, and I felt everybody was looking at me. Of course they weren't, but you think that.
Yeah.
And then there was the whole thing about the next day, September the 12th. I'm in London, briefing senior people in the BBC about the concept of jihad, about terrorism, etc. And from that point onwards, life had really altered. I mean, there's a real irony here in that I just spent a year of my life, about 11 months or so of my life, helping to run a big season of programs on Islam for the BBC. So 2 weeks before 9/11, we had a whole series of programs. We had 300 community events. We had books, magazines. We had the first documentary on the Hajj. We had a Home Front, which was a housing makeover show. We had a house made over in Islamic style. There was a Jules Holland special on Sufi music. I could go on. We had 13 or 14 programs. Prince Nassim's Beginner's Guide to Islam. He was obviously a very famous boxer at the time. And I was kind of like basking in the glory for a couple of weeks. And then 9/11 happened, and all of that went away. And it was almost like we started all over again. And suddenly we didn't just start all over again, but we were no longer just, Asians. We would become Muslims. Suddenly there was this whole thing that there was a differentiation between various different communities, that were no longer now talking about ourselves as migrants or as children of migrants. We were now a specific targeted or specific group. And when I think about my kids have grown up in a post 9/11 world. So we know a world before 9/11, and we know how we were treated, or we know how we felt, or we know what it was like to be a Muslim. And when I think about my kids, particularly my 21-year-old twins, they know nothing else but the world. So do you think that they have been, and children of that age, or anybody who doesn't remember, in their mid-20s or maybe up to the age of 30, they don't remember a world before 9/11? Do we think Muslims and non-Muslims, but Muslims in particular in America or Britain or wherever it may be, do you think that actually this has impacted them so much that they actually probably will never ever have the life that we had?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that this point about non-Muslims is so critical, because, of course, the definition of Muslim in America meant anybody who was non-Hispanic brown. And we saw that some of the first targets of revenge, if you will, and
there was a Sikh guy who was shot.
was a Sikh in southwestern America. And so this idea that the ripple effect of 9/11 then was visited upon other non-Muslim communities shows then the notion of rage and really the notion.
If I can jump in there, we actually interviewed for a documentary a couple of years later. We interviewed the guy who shot the worker in the petrol station, the Sikh guy.
Okay.
And we actually did interview him, and he was very remorseful in the sense because he was angry. But he saw the turban because he saw Bin Laden wear a turban.
Yeah.
So therefore, and that lack of religious literacy, which is probably fair enough, but that lack of religious literacy, but that anger was there, wasn't it?
And you see that, of course, spasms of that today, but we can talk about that later as far as the legacy of the 9/11 era. But this is one of the reasons why it was such a pivotal shift for me, that trying to do something, it was calling up radio shows when you would hear Islam being discussed without Muslims on there, to provide a rebuttal, to provide a clarification. I started a think tank shortly after 9/11, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which now still serves as the go-to when it comes to research on the Muslim American experience, in order to provide that corrective for policymakers, for journalists alike. But getting back to your question regarding to borrow from T-Rex, the children of the revolution, here we find an interesting angle to that. I have now at Wayne State students who are in their late teens and early 20s, meaning that they are from that generation, like your children, who have never experienced a world prior to 9/11. Now, of course, there was tumult, there was turmoil, as Billy Joel would say. You know, there's something about it's always been turning, you know, as the world's been turning, or it's always been burning since the world's been turning. And the idea that they have now acclimated to the rhythm of life, in large part which is defined by securitization, is problematic. The fact that, and maybe part of it is good, that they don't have to have something with which to contrast and compare it. When they go to the airport, they intuitively know they have to take their shoes off. They have to limit their toiletries. They have to go ahead and go through so much scanning and surveillance. The presumption of knowing that they're probably surveilled, the knowledge and familiarity with people who have maybe been detained for a certain period of time. I don't shy away from telling my students these incidents and experiences, but I also try to buffet it by telling them that I do remember the days when, for example, you could literally go up to the gate and see your friends and loved ones off. And it absolutely bewilders them that these were possibilities even to go ahead and happen.
Oh, Saeed, I remember once not having my passport for a domestic flight between Manchester and London. And I went, oh no, what am I going to do? And I was so scared. I thought, I'm going to miss this meeting now. I'm going to lose my, oh, how stupid. And I just said, all I've got is my ID. And I showed them my BBC staff card. And they went, that'll do, love. And then I was on the plane. Now, that's never going to happen now. And that was never going to happen post 9/11, obviously. But it shows you that was the world we lived in. But now they're not in that world, are they? And their world is defined by this extreme act of terror. But
and at the same time, Akhil, we have to wonder if one of the consequences of 9/11 and this now acquiescence to the fact that privacy has been impinged, that they are being surveilled, whether that has contributed to their own relationship with privacy. When you see social media and the willingness to divulge so much about them, almost as though they're thinking, well, what does it really matter anymore? Somebody or the other.
Exactly what they think.
Yeah.
I had that conversation about TikTok, about the facial recognition kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I said, we're giving all your facial recognition away. And they went, yeah, well, whatever. There's so much we give away. We give everything away.
Exactly.
Whereas, that's because they know no difference. It does play into exactly what you're saying, which is the post 9/11 generation.
Yeah, I mean, for us, I mean, if you think about the debates today about vaccination, about vaccine passports, about the idea of how much information then an employer might have about you. The younger generation certainly seems to be much more reflexive in shrugging their shoulders compared to the older generation, which remembers that life prior to 9/11, where we could be far more judicious with what we would go ahead and divulge. And there were certain things that we would just never even consider giving up. And of course, today, if you want to fly, if you want to, and I think this is the key phrase, maintain any level of normalcy in your life, or that old rhythm of life that we had before 9/11, this is what we have to pay the ferryman.
And do you think that actually, well, you know, since 9/11 and all of this, the need for security, the need for obviously the Patriot Act and all these kind of things that came in America with similar things here, how far do you think it's gone? Do you think it's gone too far? And do you think too many things have been slipped in under the radar? So therefore we have a situation now where, as you said, that generation and even our generation have acquiesced to this because they feel this needs to happen. Has it gone too far, or actually in the end did this need to happen because the world had changed?
Well, so I think those are two questions. And I think, yes, it has gone too far. And at the same time, I think, yes, we have acquiesced to it. Because instead of then living a stifled life, we really don't have an option. And for those of us who still yearn for the old sense of normalcy. That again is the price that we have to go ahead and pay. And you see this happening every single day. And I'm sure you, like I, still sometimes have those moments of hesitation before doing it, whereas the younger generation will simply do it intuitively, saying, well, yeah, okay, this is how it is. We don't have any other frame of reference by which we can compare it. I find, for example, even when I have discussions with my parents, for them, it is still a matter of saying, do we give this information? I mean, they're of a generation that still hesitates at buying things online because it means having to give their credit card information over the computer. I remember that these were individuals who bristled at giving their credit card number over the phone. So we've certainly come a long way from that when our iPhones and Androids have the credit card number already in them, or the passwords for these are already on our devices, and we simply accept and assume the risk of a mass hacking and then having to go through the rather laborious track of, first of all, remembering what our saved password is, and then having to reset it.
But I suppose, in a sense, when I think about some of these things and what we've given up or what we've not given up or the reasons for it, I mean, we do live in a world now where 9/11 actually has really shaped everything, hasn't it? Because what comes after 9/11, I suppose, it's not just the event, it's what comes after it as well, the war on terror. The so-called war on terror, really, which is the language of the journalist, the so-called war on terror, because everything has become a war on terror since. Nationalist or revolutionary, organizations with a absolute noble cause, whether it be the Uyghurs in China who have been oppressed for centuries, not just for the last few years, but for centuries, or the Kashmiris in India who have not been given the plebiscite or to decide where they go, whether it's part of India or part of Pakistan, etc. All of these kind of what were effectively at one point seen as freedom fighting or terrorists, depending on which side of the coin you're on, they have now become terrorist organizations, and we have accepted some form of strict behavior or some form of oppression because it's part of this war on terror. So in terms of the world we're in today, 9/11 really has shaped not just our individual thinking, but it's also shaped the thinking of governments and the ability, I suppose, of governments to impose further restrictions and to reclassify. Palestinians become extremists who won't get along with Israel, whereas before 9/11, there's a lot of people, particularly in the West, in Europe in particular, who were seeing them as being oppressed people who we should be helping to achieve their own statehood. But that seems to go the way. So this is the root of probably of why 9/11 has had so much impact on us.
Right. I would suggest, though, that governments have always been involved in this as far as designating groups to be terrorist or freedom fighters. I mean, after all, this is what launched Afghanistan in the first place in 1979 with the Mujahideen, as you mentioned before, with Ahmad Shah Massoud. And the rather cynical framing of conflict in order to justify their own actions. I think what's changed now is the fact that governments feel the impunity to designate their own people as terrorists. After all, China designating the Uyghur, the Modi regime in India designating the Muslims as being terrorists or potential terrorists. That notion of the domestic element to that, I think, is one of the main shifts that we see after 9/11, that the impunity by which governments can feel emboldened to do that without much pushback from the international community makes one recognize that perhaps there is a certain den of thieves, that this has become sort of a protocol that people can go ahead and invoke. But I think perhaps the greatest collateral damage from that is how it has seeped into civil society discourse. The very idea that, thanks in large part to media framing as well and the complicity with governments to go ahead and shape the narratives, people now reflexively are presuming the T word being ascribed to certain people, and particularly, I would say, Muslims. And the fact that the younger generation has simply accepted the fact that whenever they hear the word terrorism, it is now synonymous with, and I would even argue in many cases exclusive to Muslims, is problematic. Now, of course, everything has a tipping point, and there is a fatigue that can occur. And I think you are seeing that happening in some quarters. Whether that is happening, though, as a recognition of how wrong it is systemically, or whether it is just a matter of expediency, I think that's a real open question for us to see. But the idea then of what kind of pushback there is from civil society and how that might affect government framing of who's a terrorist and who's not is certainly something to examine moving forward.
But it's as you said, though, it's that whole notion, things that it's been easy for other governments to be able to class people as terrorists or to be part of the war on terror, simply because America defined what the war on terror was. And the war on terror has become, 9/11 is not actually an attack on America, but it's an attack on the Western values. That's what it has become. And so therefore, anybody who doesn't necessarily agree 100% with what is a notion of whatever a Western value is, suddenly becomes somebody who is an apologist or a member of or a supporter of or even a practitioner of terrorism. And that's what we've seen, so somebody goes from being, a conservative Muslim who refuses to shake the hand of a woman, which, to be honest with you, if you go into various certain Orthodox Jewish communities, you'll get the same response, is an extremist. And at the same time, somebody who straps a bomb to their chest and goes into a tube station or goes into any building or whatever and brutally butchers and murders innocent people is an extremist. So we seem to go from 0 to 60 in a nanosecond. Mm-hmm. Anybody who does something which is seen to be not the norm. And that didn't exist before. But actually, it's framed by 9/11. But actually, it's not even 9/11 is the reason for it. It actually goes way beyond that, because what 9/11 unleashed was a world that actually changed forever. If the world changed on that day, what it unleashed in terms of what the Americans did next, I suppose, and not just on their own, we were all there. My own government was there. Many other governments were there. What was actually unleashed after that has created the world where anything seems to go now. We've changed our direction with regards to the Uyghurs, and as it seems in the last year or two. But before that, this was going on for many years inside China and was probably being signed off. And what was going on in the Soviet republics of, the former Soviet republics in Central Asia, things were going on there. And as you talk quite rightly about what was happening in India, and obviously we can talk about Palestine and other countries as well. But you were able to do it because you were fighting. Everybody was lumped into this whole thing. They're all a bunch of extremists. They're all a bunch of terrorists. They want to destroy our way of life.
Well, I think the irony is not lost.
Get rid of that,
Well, the irony is not lost, Akhil, that we're having this discussion right now upon the passing of Donald Rumsfeld, former Secretary of Defense, who was really one of the architects of the really ill-fated war in Iraq, which, of course, now is almost unanimously determined to be a war of folly and squander. And imagine that the United States, between Iraq and Afghanistan, spent $6 trillion. China has spent 1/4 of that to create the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's where one puts their money and where one feels as though it's more important to invest, if you will. I'm always bemused by those statistics. And that, of course, not to mention just the sheer upheaval of these countries and these societies and the loss of human life involved. But look, when we're talking about the legacy of 9/11, I think two things come out that are related and in specific relief. One is that when it comes to securitization and when it comes to the framing of the Muslim as being problematic, whether on a domestic level or on an international level, Muslims then inadvertently became the canaries in the coal mine, the test case for then a securitization and a surveillance industrial complex on what we can get away with. There was the delusion among non-Muslims to say, well, of course we need to do this. The government certainly ginned up support for it to say this is for those people. But of course, you can't put the rabbit back into the hat. Once these measures came about, they created the new baseline, and they have been built up ever since then over the last 20 years. And more importantly, as we now see, they apply to everybody. There used to be the scare tactics and the feigned indignation that, oh, why are we going ahead and targeting the sweet old lady with the silver hair traveling? Why not look out for those swarthy, brown, beard-wearing Muslims? Those are the ones who are doing it. And I mean, I'd hate to think that anyone ever considered me swarthy, but at the same time, I certainly was the beneficiary of more than a few enhanced checks at the airport. But the fact that now people realize that this is uniform and this is universal and that it is here to stay is tempered with the fact that they seem to be acclimated. Now, the second point that I think is related to this is that, as you rightly mentioned, that 9/11 then became framed as this cosmological war between Western values and those who purportedly were trying to destroy that. What has it said over the last 20 years about Western values when Western liberal democracies are far less democratic and far less liberal? The idea that the edifice of the post-Cold War West upholding and again, purportedly thinking that they had won and were moving toward, as Francis Fukuyama had said, and now something that's been discredited, the end of history, himself borrowing from Hegel, of course, has shown anything but. And while people will go ahead and now say that China somehow or the other gamed the system and emerged triumphant, and this is going to be the Chinese century, as we discussed 2 years ago at the Bradford Literature Festival. I think that before we get to that assessment, we have to consider how many own goals the West itself has committed. The fact that it has shown some perhaps systemic flaws in liberal values, or at the very least, their application and implementation, is going to keep people like myself and you, I mean, a couple of academics, I think, certainly churning out our work for some time to come.
Well, I can tell you about the amount of films I've made on this subject, and it's been an incredible amount of films, because to try and understand it is very complicated, because it has unleashed into the world. It's very interesting, actually. I think it's unleashed into a world which was ready for it digitally. So the surveillance can only happen if you have the technology to actually deliver. And the technology was definitely there, or was definitely enhanced over the last 20 years. And so we do have that world we're in. There is an argument that says we may have had that world anyway, but 9/11 and the events post 9/11, whether it be bombings across Europe, the 7/7 attacks, etc., all of these things have contributed to make it easier, in a sense, to sell the notion of security as being a necessity. Because actually, you know what? Well, it is anyway. It's the level of security that you may need, and the level of surveillance that you may need. But one of the things that always astounds me is when somebody commits an appalling atrocity, we then find out afterwards that the security services seem to have them under surveillance, or they were once under surveillance, and it always makes me wonder, actually, how do these people get through if they're supposed to be under surveillance? But that's a whole different conversation to be had. But in terms of 9/11 and what happens next, obviously they unleashed and you're right, Donald Rumsfeld. It's a great time to talk about Donald Rumsfeld. Or I'm sure there's a generation of people who can't think of Donald Rumsfeld without thinking about the Cheney film, and the character that plays him as actually a bit of a lovable rogue. But actually, that lovable rogue who signed off enhanced interrogation, or if you want to put it in another word.
Well, I mean, another T word.
Something else than interrogation. But yeah. Actually, Rumsfeld and all those people, they took into war in Iraq. That war in Iraq created a vacuum where Al Qaeda was, but that then becomes ISIS. It then takes us into, because of the Arab Spring, it then takes us into the whole creation of the caliphate with Syria and the collapse of Syria. We could go on, and then the mass influx of refugees into Europe, into many other countries, it would be Lebanon, Jordan, have been completely destabilized by Syrian refugees as well. All of this is ongoing, and Afghanistan as well. We could talk about so many things. All of this comes from a desire to do something because of 9/11. And I suppose that question was that desire to do something? Well, it's understandable, but did they do the right thing? I mean, ultimately, what could they have done instead? Because actually, the world that has been unleashed since 9/11 isn't a world that any of us really would ever expected to have lived in.
Well, look, I mean, the magnitude of what happened on 9/11, of course, cannot and should not be discounted. 3,000 American lives lost. By far the most egregious terrorist attack, the most violent attack on American shores. The loss of innocence and perhaps complacency that two oceans could no longer protect the American mainland. That this was something that happened from within, not aircraft that came in from overseas, but that took off from Boston and from New York and from Washington. The fact that the United States was so egregiously asleep at the wheel for something like that happened shook the confidence not only of America, but really of the world. The fact that something like this can happen to and in America is rather disconcerting. I mean, even for those people who were salivating and who were indulging in a certain level of schadenfreude or saying, yeah, you know what, they had it coming. I think even they had to concede that a world without structure and without a certain kind of consistency is very, very daunting. And that kind of unpredictability doesn't do much for the psyche. Afghanistan was, of course, the epicenter of Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden was there until he wasn't. And there was the need to go ahead and do something. I think the fact that America felt the need to do something so quickly and having that erroneously mischaracterized as decisively was problematic. And part of that, I think, can be attributed to the whole notion of the politics that were involved. Everything in the US, of course, lives and dies by the political and the electoral cycle. And although this, of course, was extremely early on in George W. Bush's first term, only 8 months into it, he, given his psyche, given the cadre around him, Vice President Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and others who seems as though they had a pre-existing bullet in the chamber, if you will, looking for the opportunity to go ahead and fire the gun.
They wrote the pamphlet, was it Century for a New America?
The project for the New American Century had already been drafted in 1998, signed by the so-called neocons, including Francis Fukuyama, the president's brother, Jeb Bush, who was the governor of Florida, and others, to then go ahead and look for a situation to reshape. And so here you found some people who were highly opportunistic to go ahead and do that. In many ways, Afghanistan was perhaps a bit of an inconvenience and a distraction from the eye on the prize really being Iraq. And as a result of it, it perhaps shows that strategically, their plan of dealing with bin Laden and dealing with al-Qaeda in Afghanistan was flawed. Had they not been distracted by the allure of Iraq and giving that the priority ultimately, they probably could have done something that would have been far more in the realm of containment of al-Qaeda. But instead, they were clearly motivated by other lusts and by greed. And Afghanistan then, I think, suffered in many ways as a result of that.
But what has happened since? Because America obviously invades Iraq. The knock-on effect has created and destabilized that whole area. Whether it be Saudi Arabia, countries going to the right in many ways, but also the destabilization we've seen in incredibly wealthy countries like Iraq and Syria, etc. What do you think, just changing track now, when you think about the people who decided to do what they did, the Mohammed Atta and all of those kind of terrorists, and the people that organized this, whether they were in Afghanistan, Pakistan, or wherever they were, bin Laden and his lieutenants, do do you think they'd be happy with what they delivered? Because it does, if you know anything about the kind of doctrine and the kind of like what they would want to achieve in some form or other, they've not made anyone's life any better, have they? And actually, what's happened is actually you now have you've had more American troops in the Middle East than you ever had before. You've had all these countries completely destabilized. You've not seen a growth in the world that maybe Bin Laden and his team wanted. So would they see this as a success in the end, 9/11? Or ultimately, was it a bit of appalling? Was it an appalling atrocity that was ultimately theatre for them, but actually has delivered misery for Muslims because of what they did?
I don't think that bin Laden and his ilk were ever interested in creating a utopian society where they were. They were driven more by creating a dystopic society elsewhere. And in that regard, I think that they would perhaps now be feeling quite vindicated and satisfied. Their task of trying to ameliorate the conditions of Muslims was perhaps either a task too weighty to be able to accomplish, or one that really was not part of their agenda, so to speak, realizing that, again, the deck was stacked against them. But if they could go ahead and bring down, if you will, the West, or at least knock it down a few pegs, I think that was perhaps what they were looking at. And it reminds me of, to make a pop culture reference here, the movie Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, the original one with Ricardo Montalban. And he says to Kirk, Captain Kirk, he says, I don't want to kill you. I just want to hurt you. Because he feels as though that is a far greater punishment that Kirk should have, to leave him stranded on the Genesis planet, the way that he had been stranded on SETI Alpha 5, or was it 6? And the very notion that I think bin Laden, I'm not sure if he was a fan of the Star Trek movies, but certainly he seemed to be, at least on some level, channeling that idea that I'm not going to be able to bring down the West, but I can certainly go ahead and wound it from within.
Well, the philosophy was the far enemy and the near enemy.
Yeah.
If you're going to defeat Egypt, it was all about Egypt. That's the irony of all of these things, going back to the people that were around bin Laden, I should say.
Yeah.
And to get rid of the regime in Egypt, you had to get rid of the far enemy. And the far enemy is America, which is effectively the people who are propping up your near enemy, which is the Egyptian state. And so you have to bring the war to America for America to back away from your near enemy. And so therefore, then you will be in a position to take out your near enemy, which is exactly what I said. Wound them, punish them, make their life a misery, and then they will back away. But obviously, it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
What has happened is they've become more entrenched. So I suppose when we think back now, 20 years on, just trying, if you just, I think we need to wrap up at some point now. I mean, this feels like a good point to do that. I suppose 20 years on, we've talked about obviously the events that happened and the impact it had on us all individually and collectively, and what it's done for society in terms of the kind of like the surveillance, and also what it's done to the Middle East and to values around the world. About now, does anybody take American values seriously because of what they've seen happening in Iraq and the Abu Ghraib and all of those kind of appalling things that happened in the name of the war on terror? If we were to look back in another 20 years, would we, of course, something else could happen, but if we work on the basis that nothing of that nature happens again, do we think we can get back the world or some form of world that we had before, or do we think we will never think that we will have moved on and it will be like events in the Second World War that, a generation talks about it, but another generation has no idea what we're talking about?
I don't think we can ever go back. And I think that, again, one of the ironies is we're having this discussion in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic. The very idea that we can return to what things were like before March of 2020 is folly. And similarly, and this is the wonderful thing about history, is that history is replete with these moments where things reset. What makes 9/11 and COVID-19 perhaps particularly distinct is that these are global in their dimension and in their consequences. And so the idea that the entire world has shared collectively in some way or the other being impacted by these things means that we can never look back. And arguably, COVID will be that other reset, that people will push back 9/11 and its consequences into perhaps the long-term memory. And people will ask the questions, what was life like before COVID? That's the new point of departure by which we will examine things. And I mean, you see this even happening now in regions that, despite the fact that the chaos and the disruption that 9/11 certainly wrought on so many millions of people around the world, right now their big priority is getting vaccinated. And they cannot think about the past because again, to borrow from a movie, from James Bond's Quantum of Solace, when one of the women asks him, about whether you can sleep at night again, and he says something on the lines of, well, the dead don't care. And in many ways, I think that's how 9/11 will be. It will be a memory for those of us who lived through it and whose lives were directly altered by it. It will certainly have a greater impact than for those who came later, who know nothing else, and that being their starting point.
No, it's definitely true. I mean, you're right, actually. I mean, the great war photographer, or the great photographer full stop, Don McCullin, I once asked him I said, why did you stop taking photographs of war zones? And he said, because I could see the faces at night.
Yeah.
I don't know how some individuals who were behind the events of 9/11, the people who organized it and carried it out, but the people who organized it in particular, and then the people who then organized the brutality that came afterwards in the name of the war on terror. I don't know how they sleep at night without seeing the faces of people. But Saeed, I just want to thank you for that conversation. Hopefully, in a year's time, we'll see you back in Bradford. But for now, on behalf of the Bradford Literature Festival, thank you for having an engaging conversation about 9/11, the 20th anniversary, what it means for us and the world that we live in as part of our digital project. And hopefully, as I said, we'll meet each other next year. But in the meantime, Saeed, lovely to talk to you, and see you soon.
As always, lovely to talk to you. Thank you, Akhil. Thank you to the Bradford Literature Festival. And thank you for making me remember some things which, like with you, really have shaped my life for the last 20 years.